Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang, and today a special ladies Glazov Gang edition. Three of the most beautiful women in the world and also intellectuals. Our first Glazov Gang member, Ying, the senior president of SDB Partners and author of the book Chinese Girl in the Ghetto. And back by popular demand, Murrell, the national director of Politichicks.tv. Also back by popular demand, Tiffany Gabbay, the National Development Director at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Welcome back to the Glazov Gang. Ladies, I have to be careful. I'm always saying ladies and gentlemen. There are no gentlemen here except me, if I can be called a gentleman. We have a new Glazov Gang member, Tiffany and Anne-Marie. Tell Ying the rule about the Glazov Gang.
No. Dwight was so upset last time we did that. I can't. I'm not allowed. You go ahead.
Tiffany?
I don't really remember what the rule was.
What the what?
I don't remember what the rule was.
What the rule was?
No. Was it you check out but you
Okay,
never
go ahead.
leave or
Okay,
something?
go ahead. Tell her, please.
So you can check out but you can never leave.
So is this like even worse than the Roach Motel where roaches can check in but they can't check out, but we can check out, we just can't leave?
You know what? I like this.
The rule is the Roach Motel. I don't know. I don't know if that sounds very good though.
Your show has now been reused for Roach Motel.
Yeah.
Okay, so, Ying, you can check out any. Can you ladies listen, please? Okay, because this show's almost been 2 years now, and I can't. It doesn't seem to be working very well.
Maybe time to change it. It might be time.
Times they are changing.
That's right. Yeah.
Ying, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never
Leave.
Okay, and what song is that?
Hotel California.
Okay, why am I the only one interested in
right
this
now,
one?
Ying is immediately regretting her decision to come on the show.
Okay, ladies, let us begin with the serious issues of our time. Ying, welcome to the Glazov Gang. It is an honor and a privilege. And I'm a little bit nervous and taken aback with three beautiful women. I've been told to behave myself by my producer, and I'm going to do my best, okay? Ying, let us begin with The Chinese Girl in the Ghetto. Fascinating book. Introduce it to our readers and tell us why you wrote it.
Sure. So it's my memoir, and I call it a politically incorrect memoir because it describes my journey from communist China to inner city Oakland, California. And the really politically incorrect part of it is the part that describes just what a horrible place the ghetto, the inner city can be. And I talk a lot about the rampant racism, the poverty, the breakdown of law and order, just, the brokenness of the place. And that part of it has gotten me a lot of hate mail. But the message of the book is that freedom is worth choosing, and the book is sort of my journey of getting to know freedom, and the message is that there are no guarantees, obviously, but freedom offers you all kinds of opportunities to go all kinds of places.
Thank you so much, Ying. It was a fascinating, very powerful book, as relevant as ever, especially right now. I want to get into the Zimmerman case and all the sociological phenomena surrounding it. Let me just zero in a little bit more. Ying, something you're touching on is that racial minorities are also capable of racism.
Absolutely.
And in our society, there's this thing where only white people can be racist. And for instance, even the tragedy of Trayvon Martin. However, what the race hustlers are trying to do is to say that black people should be in terror of white people, whereas the statistics are actually saying that black-on-black violence is 1,000,000 times worse, or black-on-white violence, etc. So it's interesting, these double standards in our society. Ying, talk a little bit about that in terms of being an Asian minority. but the victimization that you experienced from, let's say, Spanish minorities or black minorities that is never talked about in our culture.
Sure, sure. So I grew up in Oakland, which was at the time a predominantly black town, and it was becoming increasingly Asian, increasingly Hispanic. When I showed up there, I don't believe I had ever seen a black person in person. Prior to that, I may have seen one on TV, but China is a very homogenous country, so I don't think I knew anything about black people. And when I showed up in this predominantly black town, one thing I noticed was that it was extremely racist, that black people often went around town using racial slurs, and that Asians, it didn't matter if you were Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, whatever you were, the name that you got in that town was Chinaman, and that was probably as flattering as it got. Oftentimes the terms that you were referred to were actually much more offensive. There was a lot of violence directed at Asians as well, and this is not to denigrate or to dismiss the type of racism that blacks do experience in America, because that racism is also very real. But what's disturbing about it in the inner city, the way that I experienced it and the way I grew up with it, was that nobody really cared. Very few people bothered to condemn those acts as reprehensible, whereas if you saw a white person behaving in a racist fashion toward a black person in modern-day American society, that's something that's very much frowned upon and it's not acceptable. But whereas in the ghetto, racist behavior of minorities toward minorities was very much commonplace, and those were the things that that people pretty much went with. And I think that is actually a huge problem, because unless you begin to condemn behavior that's reprehensible, you're not going to be able to change it. You're also not going to be able to get the people who are responsible for that behavior to actually take responsibility. And so that was a lot of what I saw. And so from my perspective, I've always believed that people are capable of racism, and it doesn't matter what race you are. And if you are a racist, we ought to condemn it, regardless of where the source of the racism comes from.
And Ying, thank you so much for saying that and for writing about it, because something I'm really disgusted by and that I hate is this Marxist analysis. And Joy Behar actually one time on her show very smugly said, "Don't you know that it's only those who have economic power that can be racist?" I mean, tell that to the Asian people, to the white people that have been killed, let's say, by black minorities, or about blacks that have killed blacks, or et cetera, et cetera. It's a complete heartlessness on the part of Marxists to actually say something like that, because all humans are equal in the sense that good and evil exists in all of us. So I find that the Marxist perspective actually dehumanizes those people that they pretend they want to help. Before we move on to our two other brilliant guests, I did warn Tiffany and Anne-Marie not to get on your bad side, because a Mexican girl once tried to fight you in junior high, and I don't even want to get on your bad side. What happened when that Mexican girl tried to mess with Ying Ma?
Oh my goodness.
You didn't back down. Let's start with that.
But it didn't come naturally to me either, because I was a straight A student, and the year after that fight, I actually skipped a grade. So getting into a fight in the schoolyard was just not something that I was used to doing.
Yeah.
But at my high school in the inner city, this Mexican girl used a number of racial slurs on me, and then I think she called me a Chinese bitch, and things escalated. I suppose it probably would have been wise for me to just walk away, and when I didn't walk away, she threw the first punch. And I described this incident actually in an article that I wrote for your magazine, Front Page Mag, a couple of years ago. And what I ended up doing was there was this huge standoff, and a fight ensued. There were no serious physical injuries, because despite the fact that this girl kind of pumped herself up as very much of a badass, a lot of kids tend to do that in the inner city, she really wasn't. So there wasn't any serious physical injuries, and I was rather reluctant about the fight throughout. What was most disturbing to me was that a lot of my Chinese friends sort of disappeared as soon as the fight took place, or as soon as it got started, because they just didn't want the trouble. And what was very touching to me was that one of my black friends who went to elementary school with me and who ended up in that junior high with me, she was the only person who kind of came to me, and perhaps not totally to my defense, but she was the only person who sort of stood with me. And so it once again, it kind of shows you that these racial hostilities in the ghetto are kind of complicated, but once again, all kinds of different people can be racist.
Yeah.
Mexican people can be racist too.
And Anne-Marie, your sociological analysis, or how this book and Ying's story resonates with you?
I needed to read your book so bad. As an editor of a website, Jamie, you can attest to this. Sometimes we get stuck on stories that we just want to end and stop and say, okay, look over here. There are a lot of other important. The Zimmerman trial has just taken everything, all the attention away from everything. And the main thing the Obama administration has done in our country is divide us racially. He's done that brilliantly. And basically, it's like Jamie said, he's trying to perpetuate this myth that all racism is based on white people. George Zimmerman was a white Hispanic. What the hell is a white Hispanic? I've never heard of one of those in my whole life. But it's just not true, and it's environmental. If you grow up in an area, in a tiny little bubble where everyone around you is filled with hatred, there's poverty, you feel like you can't escape it, that's what you're going to be, and it perpetuates. It grows through the generations, and you literally have to escape that with your life, which you did. And it was so beautiful to read your story about how you saved your parents. You, as a young girl, you helped them buy a house and sell a house and had to figure out all those paperwork and everything and got them out of there. And I mean, you're like a lump of coal that was pressured into turning into a diamond by force, and it could have gone so much worse. And the ironic thing about this, if your family had landed from China, if they had gone a couple of miles north or south from where you were, you wouldn't have had a story. You would have just been another brilliant young girl who went to an Ivy League school.
You're being far too kind.
But I mean, it wouldn't have been the same story.
Right.
And what I want to add to that, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. The key points.
This book. Read this book. I'm
Key
sorry.
points there. I'm only adding to the beautiful, important things that you've said about this, because also being from Russia, what I loved and what Anne-Marie's stressing is the importance of choices. And in the book, you write about how I could have spent money maybe on gear or labeled clothing or sneakers, and you're alluding to a certain culture that prioritizes certain things. But you made choices to use the money in other ways that led to your empowerment, which means that maybe disadvantaged people, whoever they may be, might not be legitimate and always blaming society, because it's up to individual choices. But I think that somebody from a totalitarian society might understand that better, right?
Right, because you come from a society that has so very little, and then you show up in America, and of course the desire is to take advantage of everything, whether it's material goods or educational opportunities, rather than taking them for granted. And I think in my book I tried to sort of talk a lot about my family, because you don't do this alone, and I think it was hard for me growing up to do a lot of stuff that adults had to do, like you said, having to figure out the paperwork for buying a house and selling a house.
There's stacks this big.
So, but then my parents also made a lot more sacrifices for me that other American parents don't have to do for their kids, and so it's shared sacrifice, and I don't think I did anything that was extraordinary for kids of immigrant parents. I think a lot of kids in the Asian immigrant communities, and I'm sure kids in the Latin communities too, do a lot for their families. But I would just emphasize that it's a shared sacrifice type of deal, and which is something that we also perhaps should emphasize a bit more in our society as well.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Ying. And now, Tiffany, you have been silent, but I'm sure a lot of wisdom is about to come out, especially from a girl from Brooklyn.
Oh, God. Okay. Well, Ying, I think your book was incredibly timely.
Thank you.
For two reasons. Number one, with regard to race. Obama came along and he was supposed to be this great uniter. No longer did we have black and white and Hispanic and Asian, but we were all going to be these United States of America. And yet we've never had a more racially polarizing president and administration. We literally have our Attorney General fueling riots at this very moment. completely, basically condemning the Zimmerman verdict. We had Zimmerman referred to as a white perpetrating a crime against a young black man. No mention of his Hispanic roots at the time, if you remember when this actually happened. Just to whitewash everything and completely pretend that the issue that you speak about in your book, that racism does exist among Hispanics and among blacks, and they do perpetuate racist acts and violence and racial epithets against other minority groups. So I think that was incredibly timely and important. And then your book also talks about just the entire immigrant experience. You literally had the exact same experience as those black and Hispanic youths with very little to no money, living in the harshest of conditions in terms of poverty, violence, crime, and yet you were able, because you had the right value set and the right ethics, and obviously a part of that you allude to was part of your upbringing, obviously in China, and you have a good family, and sometimes, there are family issues that are a lot more complex, perhaps, in the inner city when it comes to blacks and Hispanics. Certain family units can be broken down, and there can be, we can go into a whole debate on what breaks down in terms of the family unit with some people who are growing up in these environments, which they use as an excuse to kind of not get out of the ghetto and not to exceed and not to excel. But your experience taught us, and everyone who basically says they're a victim of circumstance, that no, they're not. We just take our opportunities for granted here, but you did not, obviously, because you came from an authoritarian state where opportunities were not present. So I thought your book was important for both of those very different but important reasons.
Can I ask something, Anne-Marie and Tiffany? How come you guys aren't so nice to me about my book? Ladies, we are out of...
Did you really?
Ladies, we are out of time in our first segment, but I'd like to give the last word to Ying on why you wrote your book and maybe a follow-up on something that's been said here.
Sure. Well, thank you all so much for your kind words. I wish everybody who's read my book had such kind things to say, because I get a lot of hate mail, and sometimes it's from very ignorant people, but sometimes it's from people who are well-intentioned but are just having a very hard time accepting what I have to say. And so there are lots of, I get hate, I get perhaps not hate mail, but very hostile messages from certain black people as well, and they say, I'm not a racist, and and I don't appreciate the way that you portray my community, and blacks in fact are very violent toward other blacks, and and there's a lot of black on black crime, and you just happen to have lived in that neighborhood, and so what happened to you was just what happens to people when they live in poor neighborhoods, and it's not the product of racism and so on. So there's a lot of that going on. There are a lot of people who are unwilling to accept the reality of the racial dynamics. So I appreciate the kind words.
Thank you very much. A very powerful book and a very important book, and especially extremely even relevant for our times with Zimmerman and everything going on. Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, get it? We'll be back in just a minute for our second segment where we discuss the race hustling after the Zimmerman verdict. We'll see you in a minute.